Good afternoon. My name's Jim Walker and I'm a Principal Scientist with Plant and Food Research in Hawke's Bay, New Zealand, where I have been working with tree fruit IPM for my entire career since graduating as a student from Washington State University in the mid-1980s. I've had a long association with Washington State University and have known many of the people at the Tree Fruit Research Centre in Wenatchee. Special thanks to Betsy for inviting me here to speak to you today about development of a pilot codling moth SIT program in New Zealand. I want to start with an overview of the New Zealand apple industry because I think that's important. Some of the statistics: we've got 940 registered orchards, so about 10,500 hectares or 25,000 acres. Our production is around 600,000 tonnes and fully 90% of the Class 1 fruit is exported. We have only 5 million domestic consumers, so we have to focus on exports. We have 57 packhouses and 83 exporters. The industry went through some tough times in the early 2000s following deregulation of the single desk system of selling apples, and by 2012 export earnings had dropped to just $350 million per annum. By 2021 that's almost now at $1 billion worth of exports, and the industry has realistic aspirations of being a $2 billion export industry by 2030. Talking about our export markets, we have high productivity in New Zealand orchards, and 60 to 100 tonnes per hectare is quite common. But we do have a high cost, not of production, but for labour and shipping. Traditionally, our markets have been the EU and UK that have taken up to 70% of the crop in that earlier period. But today it's all about Asia, and fully 50% of the New Zealand apple crop goes to large markets: Thailand, China, Taiwan, Vietnam. So the industry is very much focused on Asian exports. New Zealand's growing regions and our seasonal climate, it's a mild maritime climate. So the temperatures are moderate, and summer temperatures, the mean temperatures are in the range of 20 to 25 degrees C, and our winter temperatures, again the means in the range of 12 to 16 degrees. Hawke's Bay is 2/3 of our export crop, and that's at 39 degrees of latitude. Nelson about 25%, and then we drop down to Central Otago at just 4%, and that's at 46 degrees of latitude. So a similar latitude to Washington industry. If we think about codling moth in New Zealand, it's very different to codling moth in Washington State. We have just 1 to 2 generations per season, 2 generations in the North Island region. Thinking about our crop production system, it's all integrated fruit production by and large, or IFP, and that was a requirement for the supply of EU and UK markets in the mid-1990s. The old organophosphate program of the mid-1990s quickly faded away. Over a period of about 10 years, the industry completely transferred from a conventional organophosphate-based program through into the selective and biological insecticides that it uses today. Mating disruption use has increased and expanded. We have both codling moth and leaf roller mating disruption through the use of combination dispensers. So our selective pesticides maximise the opportunity for biological control while also helping to minimise the risk of pesticide residues. And under that regime, pests that have declined that were previously important are mealybugs, woolly apple aphid, leaf hoppers and leaf rollers. If we think of the effect of the IFP program and biological control on insecticide toxicity and use in apples in New Zealand, many of the old, previously highly toxic products have now gone from the program, and today it's really only the use of soft or selective pesticides. Insecticide use, the number of applications has fallen by about 50% nationally, but today we use just 1.4 kilograms of active ingredient per hectare, which is about a 90% reduction from the mid-1990s. The industry has been focused on a low residue crop protection program. The use of the logo, 100% pure apples from New Zealand, is part of that philosophy. The 90% reduction in insecticide loading and the selective pest management program has been great, but it has increased the risk of codling moth. New Zealand apples factors driving the crop protection program, the export drivers. We're exporting to 70 or more countries. The EU and UK market wants IFP and towards residue-free, so we've got to produce as close as we can residue-free fruit for Europe, whereas for Asia it's all about phytosanitary control and being pest-free. The grower's conundrum for global market access is to get those ultra-low residue and pest-free crops while still producing premium quality fruit. It's quite a challenge. In terms of the residue-free technologies, we've got mating disruption. About 40% of our export crop is grown with mating disruption. Codling moth granulosis virus is quite widely used, and of course we've been evaluating the sterile insect technique as to how we can incorporate that into our production systems. The codling moth sensitive markets, Asia, we do have a regulatory systems-based risk management system for the control of codling moth. Orchards must be registered with the Ministry of Primary Industries, and that starts before the trees have even finished bloom. There's lots of pheromone monitoring, IPM thresholds, use of mating disruption, treatment responses and records. So it's the whole pathway, all the way through to packing and grading. Everything is audited, all of the inputs, all of the assessments. So it's fully traceable production, all control decisions, the field assessments, the packhouse measures, and of course all of that is independently audited. Out of that, we've had a good history of codling moth control. New Zealand apples shipped to Taiwan. In the last 10 years, there has not been a single codling moth find in New Zealand apples in Taiwan. The potential benefits of codling moth SIT for New Zealand apple growers. It's all about enhancing market access, the importance of codling moth sensitive Asian markets. The Asian market premiums are some $20,000 to $50,000 per hectare of additional revenue for the grower, and also really thinking about how to challenge some of the existing phytosanitary measures, namely the mandatory methyl bromide fumigations that are required for certain markets. We also want to further reduce the codling moth risk in our export crops while producing residue-free fruit. The marketing advantages. Global market access is really important for the New Zealand apple grower. We want to maintain pest-free fruit and at the same time low residue fruit out of the same production system. The importance potentially is also there for insecticide resistance management to reduce the risk of resistance, although we've never encountered a problem in New Zealand with codling moth resistance to insecticides. SIT program starts with Canadian moths from the OKSIR facility in Okanagan and begins with a flight from Penticton Airport through to Hawke's Bay, New Zealand. The international flight is about 23 hours 35 minutes, but in total time it's about a 30-hour transit. The moths are kept immobile throughout, so they're shipped at about 2 degrees C. We've been receiving weekly imports of 120,000 moths. The location of the pilot SIT program, it's out of Hastings in an area called Central Hawke's Bay around Onga Onga, as you see there, so about 50 kilometres away from Hastings. The orchards are isolated. They have low codling moth densities at the outset. There were just 3 orchards in 2014, and that increased to 9 by 2020. The area, 129 hectares at the start, increased to 470 hectares by the end of the program, and there were a mix of IFP and organic orchards in the program. The SIT moth release rates, 153 to 364 per hectare per week, or 2,000 to 4,500 per hectare per season. So in total there were about 12 releases per season, and we had an initial overflooding ratio of about 70 to 1. That's 70 SIT moths to every wild moth that we believe to be out there. Other IFP control measures were in place. Mostly mating disruption was used, but not always. And typically 2 insecticides are applied per season for general pest control, including codling moth. In terms of season-long catches of wild codling moth on those SIT orchards over time, In 2013 and 14, the population's initially low at or around 1 moth per hectare per season. That's at a trapping density of 1 trap per hectare. By 2019-20, the populations were now ultra low, 1 moth per 20 hectares or thereabouts. So that's 1 moth all season in trapping across about 50 acres. So we reached a 90 to 95% reduction, but we never reached zero. There were occasional wild hosts of codling moth that we couldn't remove entirely from the sources of risk, but that was intended to be part of the program. In 2020-21, there was no increase in codling moth despite no releases of SIT moths due to New Zealand's lockdowns because of the COVID pandemic. So changes in our SIT moth delivery systems. There have been changes throughout the program. We started pretty modestly with bikes in 2014. We soon progressed to a drone delivery system, a drone or a UAV, and then more recently have been using a DJI hexacopter as part of the program. The monitoring, 1 trap per hectare is standard requirement across export orchards in New Zealand. We have been using 10x lures because that's a requirement for mating disruption, and then weekly readings of traps identifying the SIT moths. So the SIT moth recaptures, what we have here is the number of moths recaptured per week per 10,000 SIT moths released. So you can see the recoveries were in fact quite low, with moths delivered by plane being the least recovered compared to ground-based delivery systems and the hexacopter. It's just explaining that a little bit more. What we've got here is the season-long moth recaptures by the various modalities, the bike, the hexacopter, or the UAV or plane, and the SIT moth recaptures. The hexacopter, we were getting around about 1.5% of the moths released back into our pheromone traps under our monitoring program. Whereas ground-based delivery systems, it was about 0.3%, and the drone perhaps representing the smallest number of recaptures. Comparison of our moth delivery systems. The UAV drone typically is flying at an altitude of 45 to 60 meters, depending on the number of pine trees and other major obstacles around, carrying a payload of 22,000 moths, dual pods, 1 under each wing. What we find is that sometimes in sort of breezy conditions, challenging conditions for moth delivery, and certainly as the wind speed increases, we couldn't fly in wind speeds above about 25 kilometers an hour. There was increasing moth drift with altitude. The hexacopter is introduced to address that problem, flying at about half the altitude and with half the payload. What we could see on those orchards where we were delivering not only 15-fold more moths using the drone, they were actually quite uniformly distributed. So we felt that the hexacopter was perhaps delivering the moths more efficiently to the intended treated area, whereas we were losing quite a lot out of the orchard potentially with our UAV drone delivery system. Now the work rates for each delivery method, so the times are indicated below, the various orchard sizes for whatever modality we were using, drone, hexacopter, vehicle or bicycle. So what we can see here is that for the smaller orchards up to about 60 hectares, the hexacopter is the most efficient, time efficient delivery system. So not only moth efficient, but also time efficient for those smaller orchards. The drone taking time to set up and take off and chart its course. But as soon as we get to larger orchards, over about 60 hectares, we're into the drone being considerably more efficient, about half the time to treat large orchard areas. So all of the flights were controlled flights, controlled with GPS coordinates, and could fly a prescripted pathway for as near as possible targeted delivery to the orchard. So the drone was most efficient at scale, required about 150 metre runway for safe takeoff, but also required a skilled pilot, particularly for landing. That was somewhat hazardous, and particularly if conditions were a little bit windy. Nevertheless, they're relatively inexpensive to repair, being foam planes, so they were quite inexpensive to operate. Copters, more flights are required, so slower. Visual flight is perhaps a little bit easier, particularly under New Zealand's CAA. That's an agency that controls the use of drones, but could be flown by any reasonably techy operator, and to date we've had no crashes. We have looked at various release device developments. We have GPS automated opening systems at various waypoints around our circuits. So the drone pods, we have an airspeed of about 60 to 70 kilometres an hour, delivering the payload fully over about a 10-minute flight with progressive opening of the chute at the back of the tube. The hexacopter hopper is a combination of gravity plus air feed for Moth delivery. So again, all things GPS automated opening increasing at the various waypoints around the circuits. We've also been looking at experimental release devices, namely for the copters, in terms of trying to achieve, different delivery systems and better Moth survival from the delivery system. In 2019, we planned expansion to Hawke's Bay. Hastings City is a city of about 70,000 people, and there are peri-urban populations of codling moth and orchards nearby. Our trapping grid across the city identified moth populations up to about 0.4 moths per trap per day, so about 3 moths per trap per week. That was important as part of our planning and thinking about the consequences of moving to an area-wide program. But we also surveyed residents' attitudes. Attitudes to the SIT moth releases were generally positive, and surprisingly also to drone flights, where they knew that might help to reduce the frequency of air blast spraying activity in those adjacent areas to our urban environment. Everything changed in March 2020, COVID-19. What a year. We've had various lockdowns and that in New Zealand, but have largely been COVID-free until Omicron arrived recently. We've had no entry, the borders have been closed, and really quite a strict bubble in the South Pacific. There have been no direct flights, no SIT moth shipments have been possible, and so the program was suspended. The economics and benefits of an SIT program. The pilot SIT program, the total area around 470 hectares or 1,200 acres. Science and industry funding support. OK SIR subsidised moth shipments. The actual cost was around $238 per hectare, or US about $64 per acre, but in reality the true costs were probably closer to $500 per hectare. Air freight to New Zealand was 50% of the total program cost. The benefits of the SIT program: residue-free pest management is really what the industry wants. Long-term suppression of codling moth is another advantage. And local elimination of the codling moth market access risks is something that all growers want to achieve. Potentially it is there for if we can further lower the pest status of codling moth in New Zealand, which is already low. Some possibility of renegotiation of the phytosanitary measures. Mandatory fumigation with methyl bromide is really something that the industry wants to eliminate. So the future for SIT codling moth in New Zealand, this is a New Zealand perspective. SIT moth supply, the Canadian shipments were economically and logistically challenging, so we've been looking at other ways of perhaps achieving SIT moth production in New Zealand, potentially through the importation of eggs, which might be reared and irradiated in New Zealand. We don't yet have that irradiation facility, but potentially through our preparedness for fruit fly border incursions, we could develop such a facility in New Zealand. The issue is really who funds that. An apple industry perspective, use in defined production areas is a possibility rather than, in fact, fully area-wide national programs. It does potentially provide that additional level of market risk protection for our export programs. And again, the target is those sensitive export markets in Asia, particularly Japan and Korea, and the potential for the technology to create areas of pest freedom or potentially areas of low pest prevalence, which might be helpful in negotiating the use and elimination of mandatory methyl bromide fumigations. The challenge for SIT in New Zealand is not now. COVID-induced labour shortages, disrupted shipping schedules, even harvesting is particularly challenging at the moment, so our growers are focused on those bigger issues, not SIT at the moment. And with that, I'd like to close my talk. I'd like to say thank you. Thank you to Betsy for inviting us to have the opportunity to speak, and also acknowledge the many parties that have contributed in some way to the SIT program in New Zealand. Thank you.